Hi everyone, Christoph the Polish Geek, and welcome to another movie review. Because when I was in the United States, I got the chance to actually see one movie. Because yes, I was mostly hanging out with friends and visiting places I miss and love. But one time in the evening, I was actually pretty bored, so I just went to Providence Place Mall because that's where I stayed. Providence, at least part of the say I was in Providence. So I went to Providence Place Mall. I remember how much I used to visit that mall a lot, and so the dreaded Snow White. And yes, I've been saying a couple of times that I refuse to watch any Disney live action remake in cinema, so they just watch it to just hate on it for the sake of hating on it. And so, in other words, they just hate watch it. Well, basically, yes, I'm not gonna hide that, and just to see if it really will live up to its terrible reputation that it already deservedly got before it was even released, with ever since Disney just remaking all their animated classics with live action and all that, and then Rachel Zegler spewing her bullshit and cringy, and so many cringy things that nobody in their right mind could ever hope this would be any good, but it wasn't really as bad as we all expected. And I have to be objective in my honest review. And if I'm being honest, no, I actually don't think so. I mean, it's still a terrible movie. Don't get the wrong idea, it's still a pretty terrible movie, but I wouldn't say it's actually one of the worst Disney remakes. The worst will always be Pinocchio. Granted, that's might be my bias, because the original animated Pinocchio is my favorite Disney animated movie of all time, and actually my favorite animated movie of all time, and one of my favorite movies of all time. So that's entirely my bias. Why I think that Pinocchio is probably the worst, and then close second is Peter Pan, and The Lion King is also terrible. They're just a pure CGI fest. But Snow White is also pretty terrible. And now let's dissect why. But the first thing we'll talk about is address the elephant in the room, which is Rachel Zegler and her toxic personality. Like, Rachel Zegler is a huge drama queen, and already seeing her in the lead role was already pretty cringy, but I'll try my best to set aside my bias against Rachel Zegler, because that's what you gotta do when you objectively try to review a movie. Even in this case, it's really hard, but from a pure objective standpoint, if I wanna be objective, I can't say her performance as Snow White is bad. In fact, it was actually quite good. I just gotta be objective. And she is also a pretty good singer. In other words, you can say, great singer, pretty good actress, really great and likable character, a terrible human being. But leaving that aside out, I have to say she is doing a pretty good job as Snow White. And Snow White is actually somewhat likable in this movie, and she has certainly a lot more personality than she had in the original Disney animated classic. Although I would not go see as far as some people say that, oh, she's so boring in the original. No, like, she was just sweet and innocent, and that's all she was supposed to be, just sweet and innocent. And they're certainly really trying to make her way more badass here, but all this marketing that she'll just be this really annoying girl boss and all that and no romance are simply not true, because there is a romance in this movie, and I can't say she's just like one of those cringy, annoying girl bosses. I can't say that at all. As I said, she's actually, I was surprised to say, but as a character, she's quite likable, actually. Although anytime you see Rachel Zegler's face, it's just hard not to remember how different the actual actress that plays her here is. So I've been all saying how I think that Rachel Zegler, as I said, I can't hide that she's actually doing a pretty good job as Snow White, and Snow White is certainly an entirely different character than she was in the original animated classic, but I can't say she's unlikable, just different. But at the same time, I have to say this at the expense of everything else, because one of the most amazing things about the original animated classic, and by the way, I really love the original animated Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs classic. Like, this is one of my favorite Disney movies. It's the one that is the very first Disney movie, and I still think it's one of the best. I love the original animated Snow White, actually. Here, again, it's very much one of my favorites. But the best parts in this movie, I think, are actually the Seven Dwarfs and the Evil Queen. But the Seven Dwarfs here it's sometimes I have feeling like it's entirely possible to actually add it at the last minute, because it's not like they have such a huge role like they did in the original. Like here it feels like basically, oh look, that's the dwarves, and they do the famous hi ho, it's home from work we go. Great song, by the way, not this version of it, but great, but the original is fantastic. And then, other than Dopey having a slightly different role here, we'll get to it later, I did honestly feel like the dwarves were just like added like for the sake of, oh look, we are trying to keep what people loved about the original, because honestly they don't really have that much of a big role in this story. It's like during their introduction they have a big role and then they just kind of vanish. And by the way, we all remember that infamous picture that was released that supposedly were the dwarves. But newsflash, those are not the dwarves. Those are like bandits, like the resistance against the evil queen. But I don't know if that's what they were really intended to be all along, or if they just rewrote the script and made them bandits, and if this originally were actually supposed to be dwarves. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if that was actually, if the script was changed and they made them into bandits, because who knows what's behind the scenes. Like there's so much drama in Disney now that just no one knows what's behind the scenes. But I wouldn't be surprised if those did originally intend to be dwarves, but later they just changed them into like those Robin Hood style bandits who resist against the evil queen. But that's what they are. And another thing that I have to mention is that also in a classical fashion of Disney live action remakes that generally tend to think they're smarter and better than they actually are, is that in the beginning there was a lot of exposition, which is one of the major problems of those Disney live action remakes. In addition to the fact that they completely lack magic of original animated classics, they also just add so much stuff, exposition, all that, and it almost feels like Disney is basically now saying, oh, animation are not real movies. Let's remake our classics to make them real movies, and add so much like as a way to say, oh, our original animated classics sucked, because that's honestly now what it starts feeling like with those live action remakes. It literally thinks like Disney now thinks that the original animated classics were not good movies, like which is like I cringe even at the thought of it, because the original animated movies is like what made Disney great. They're classic. This is what Disney was always famous for. That's why everyone loved Disney so much. But yep, now that's what those live action Disney remakes literally feel like. It just feels like they're just like Disney basically thinking that their original animated movies sucked and just trying basically to like give audience a real movie. And by the way, I really hate that mentality that animation isn't real art. Like an animated movie can totally be better than a live action movie. In fact, animation is actually one of my favorite genres. Like what the hell? Like I really hate that attitude, which unfortunately it seems like Disney very much has this attitude towards animation, even though animation is the very thing that made them famous. And the final thing I have to talk about that also was pretty trashy in this movie is Gal Gadot's performance as the evil queen. Like she was so terrible. Like when the Gal Gadot was cast as the evil queen, I thought, she looks the part. She might actually be the only thing that will make the movie somewhat watchable. But no, she's actually one of the worst parts of the movie. This is like one of the worst performances I've ever seen. Like the original evil queen from the animated movie, she felt like evil, like intimidating, like scary. Even though she barely fought, like she actually felt like a really evil person that you're just afraid to even be in her kingdom. But this one, it's like the movie constantly tells you she's just a scary, terrible dictator, but she just feels so cheesy and campy. And even when she transforms into the witch, because again, in the original animated classics, the queen and the witch, even though technically the same person, their personalities were so different that in some ways she felt like a separate character, but it perfectly made sense. But here, her transformation feels more like just swapping a coat and just like imitating a voice, and yeah, like, yep. Snow White is indeed a terrible movie, and it's not like anyone expected it to ever be good anyway. Although, I will have to mention one interesting thing, and I was actually quite surprised, but I gotta mention that. That involves spoilers, but I will mention something relating to the defeat of the evil queen. Because the interesting thing is, her defeat though was actually far closer to how it was in the original Grimm fairy tale as opposed to the Disney movie, because we all know the famous scene in the Disney movie, Thunder and the Queen as the witch falls to her death, but here it was actually far closer to how she was in the original fairy tale. She asks the mirror one more time, who is the fairest of them all, and then mirror says, your niece, and the Queen breaks the mirror, as a result she gets destroyed as a punishment for that. And that's actually far closer to her final fate in the original fairy tale. But then again, this dumb Easter egg doesn't really solve the movie as a whole. It doesn't change the fact that the movie is pretty much what I said it was. Oh, and I remember now, one more thing I want to talk about, but really forgot, but now will. Remember how I said that Dopey is actually quite different? Like, because in the original animated movie, Dopey was just there for laughs. Like, he never talks, he never tried, and then it just mostly used for comedy and never gets brought up again. But here, they actually turn it tragic, and it actually becomes his whole character arc, and he does actually, spoiler alert, manage to learn how to talk in the end, which I guess it's a harmless addition. Like I guess that if there are any changes that I don't mind, actually it's this one, but this change, I guess, it's not bad. Just pointless to an otherwise pretty terrible movie. Overall, Snow White 2025 is almost pretty much what everyone expected it to be, but I guess you could say that the redeeming thing about it is that at least somewhat watchable. Something that I can't really say about Pinocchio or Peter Pan, but again, being somewhat watchable isn't really a saving grace. Will it end up being the worst movie of 2025? It might, but I'm actually calling that the remake of How to Train Your Dragon will be even worse. Granted, that's probably because I really love the original trilogy of How to Train Your Dragon, but still. Overall, Snow White 2025 is indeed a terrible movie, and the only saving grace about it is that Snow White, as I said, is admittedly a pretty likable character, even if played by a really cringy actress. But thank you all of you for checking out this video. Press the like button, please subscribe to this channel, and I will talk to you soon in another movie review. Talk to you very soon. Bye.